Here, Circuit Court, Branch 33 in Milwaukee County, now in session. Honorable Lawrence C. Graham, Jr. presiding. Silence is commanded. You may be seated.
You know, yesterday at the afternoon recess, I tried to give my deputies a very fast course, both in singing and in German, and I understand it didn't come out so good. So it's obviously the responsibility of the teacher. Ready to proceed, Mr. McCann?
Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
When you interviewed the defendant in January, was there discussion between you and him about his childhood?
Yes, there was.
And you spent several hours discussing that. You had already received substantial information. Is that correct?
Yes, I spent the better part of the first day on his...
I'm not sure if his microphone is connected. Seems to me...
No, the system's not on. Is it? Yeah.
I spent the better part of the first day discussing with Mr. Dahmer his development from birth until the time of the first killing, I believe.
And you had received, to assist you in that consideration, numerous documents from the Milwaukee Police Department, the Bath, Ohio Police Department, school records, and various other materials. Is that correct?
Yes, including materials based on interviews with his family and people who knew him during those years.
The jury has heard much of that. I'm just going to address two particular points. Did any of that evidence that the defendant had been subjected to sexual abuse within his home in any fashion?
No, consistently, everyone has said that that did not occur.
And was there any evidence that the defendant was subjected to physical abuse within his home?
Again, there's no evidence of that, and everyone has consistently said that did not occur.
Did you also discuss the death of Stephen Hicks with him?
Yes.
This is the death that occurred when he was in June of 1978, shortly after the defendant graduated from high school. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you spend substantial time discussing that death?
Yes.
And I won't go into detail with that, but did you keep that in mind, both the childhood background and the Stephen Hicks death in the assessment you made of the defendant?
Yes, I did.
After that slaying of Mr. Hicks, the defendant spent the rest of the summer apparently in Bath, Ohio, and then entered the Ohio State University and spent the first semester at that university. Did you examine material relating to that and discuss that with him?
I did. I'm not sure if it was a semester or a quarter.
At the Ohio State University.
Right.
During that time, one would assume that he was exposed to numerous young men that he would find attractive. That is a large Midwestern land-grant college. Are you aware of that?
I am.
Ohio State. All right. Did you have any comment or any reflections on the fact that there appeared to be no sexual assaults, matters of that sort conducted by the defendant during that period?
He told me...
Any comments on that?
Well, he told me that after the Hicks killing, he was quite concerned about what he had done and wished to get rid of that memory, which had upset him, and that he was eager to avoid that kind of activity. I think the fact that he did avoid it for what then became a prolonged period is an indication of his capacity to control his conduct and conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, even though he continued to have the same paraphilic interests during that entire period.
The record reflects that he entered the military in December of 1978, went into training in the southern part of the United States, became a medic, was transferred to Germany, the Baumholder area. Did there come a time that you discussed that portion of his life with him?
Yes.
And would you share with the jury the particular points you would think would be of interest on the subject issues?
Well, I think the most salient fact is that Mr. Dahmer indicated that he did not, in fact, commit any sexual offenses or kill anyone during the time that he was in the Army. And what he told me was that he had satisfied himself during that period with masturbation and the use of pornography. And he told the police that too, that he had no homosexual relationships with men during that time. He committed no paraphilic acts during that time, and that he was able to satisfy himself with masturbation. He would from time to time buy gay pornography and make use of that in masturbation.
But exercised control in terms of there being no sexual assaults, anything of that sort.
That's right. Despite the paraphilia continuing, he was able to not only not act on it, but actually indicated that he didn't fantasize about it too much during that time.
He was mustered out then in March of 1981 and went to Miami, Florida for a period of approximately 6 months, occasionally lived on the beach. Did you discuss that period of his life with him?
Yes, I did.
And did you in particular discuss his sexual activities or absence of activities or what was transpiring in that realm of his life?
I did.
And would you share what conclusions you drew or what was said with the jury?
Well, once again, there was this period during which Mr. Dahmer did not engage in any paraphilic activities or commit any offenses related to any paraphilia. He said that basically during that time he was too busy with work to become involved in any relationships.
He then moved to Ohio, and apparently in the latter part of 1981, and either late 81 or early 1982, moved to his grandmother's residence in West Allis, Wisconsin. And sometime thereafter secured a job with a plasma corporation on the west side of our city. Did you discuss that period of his life with him?
Yes, I did.
Is there anything you'd like to share with the jury on that?
Well, the one salient fact from that period, and I should point out there's some difficulty in ascertaining exactly the dates or years of events during that early period he was in West Allis, but apparently before a time when he began to focus his attention on religion, there was an occasion while working at the plasma center that he did do something unusual. I had, of course, been aware that he'd been working at the plasma center and was on a daily basis drawing blood from individuals who were donating blood to be used for concentrating material for blood bank. And I asked him if he had any particular interest in blood, thinking that perhaps that's what had led him to seek out that job. And he said that he remembered one time when he did take a vial of blood home, a test tube, and that he tried tasting blood once. It was the blood of a Native American man, and I asked him, did you drink it straight? He said, right. It didn't taste good. Yuck, yuck, that's the way it was. But I kept it long enough until it solidified. I don't know why I kept it, what I was planning on doing with it. I ended up throwing it away, so I had some strange ideas even then. I asked, it was fresh when you drank it? And he said it was. I said, where were you when you did this? And he said that he'd gone to the roof of the blood center during the lunch break and that he'd taken home what was left over from that particular test tube of blood. I asked whether he drank any at home, and he said he did not. I asked whether that was because he had tried it once, and he said that's why. I asked him how he made sure that he didn't walk back down to the plasma center with blood dripping on his chin, and he said that he just spit it out on the rooftop. He had just wanted to see what it tasted like, that he didn't know why he wanted to see what it tasted like, but had the idea and carried it out. I then asked if there was anything in that for him, and he said, just the strange excitement in seeing what it tasted like, but I don't even know why I wanted to do it, just for the experience, I guess. I asked, but this isn't a sexual excitement you're describing? And he said, it wasn't then, no. That's the only unusual conduct that I'm aware of during that particular period.
And then did there come a time, approximately 1983 and 1984, that he indicated that he came under the grandmother's influence in terms of her religious commitments and started to attend church and directly addressed certain activities within his life?
Yes.
And would you share that with the jury, what he told you about that?
Well, he said that there was a period of approximately 2 years when he tried to commit himself to religion, to going to church, and to reading the Bible, and that during that period, when he was trying to avoid alcohol and avoid indulging his sexual urges, he was largely successful at doing that, that from time to time he would feel the need to have some sexual release, and he would handle it during that period. He told either the police or me, I'm not sure now who, that he would try to stimulate himself by rubbing against the bed or some other object of that sort, so that he wouldn't be touching himself, and that it wouldn't exactly be masturbation, but so that he'd be able to gain some sexual relief. But by and large, that he managed during that time to suppress not just sexual activity, but even sexual thoughts and desires most of the time, and was able to refrain from drinking.
And did any report a particular incident involved at the West Dallas library?
Yes.
At this point, would you share that with the jury?
Well, Mr. Dahmer's reported to everyone who's asked him about this period an incident in which he was reading in the library and someone dropped a note in his lap propositioning him for sex in the men's room, and that he saw that as a turning point for him. Although he didn't accept the proposition, that was when he decided to abandon this quest for spiritual guidance and the reliance on religion. And that thereafter, he made two changes. The first was that he told me that it seemed that religion wasn't working, and so he temporarily flirted with another possibility, namely whether there was a spiritual system involving satanic beliefs that might be attractive. He looked into that and rejected the metaphysics of it. Didn't find the philosophy very appealing, except for the emphasis on self-indulgence, which he did like. And so basically rejected the ideas that went along with that view. But then he decided to explore the gay underground and discovered it through adult bookstores, through the bathhouses, and through gay bars. And so he began to engage in sexual relations with a variety of men.
From that period then, 1978, as far as you could determine from the slaying of Mr. Hicks in approximately June of 1978, until he started to explore the gay underground, as you've described it, during that period of 7 years or so, he apparently maintained control and did not even involve himself in homosexual activities with other people. Would that be accurate?
Yes, it is.
When after this library incident, he became involved in the porn shops, the gay bars, and the bathhouses. Did there come a time that he expressed dissatisfaction with the activities at the bathhouse that caused him to adopt the drugging procedure?
Yes.
Would you briefly share that with the jury?
Mr. Dahmer had at that time been able to be with partners in bathhouses where, behind closed doors for a modest fee, he'd be able to have a room with a bed in it for as long as desired. But he said that it wasn't ideal for him because the men that he was with often desired a greater variety of sexual activities than he did. As I believe I mentioned yesterday, his principal desires were to lie with someone and masturbate and gently fondle and touch and rub and such things. But many of the other men wanted to engage in what Mr. Dahmer described as something other than soft sex. They wanted to have anal intercourse with him, and they would have some set period of time they were willing to devote to the contact. He wanted to stay with them longer, and he didn't want to do some of what they wanted to do. And it's because of those concerns that he began to drug the men in the bathhouses so that they would not be making these demands on him, and they wouldn't be leaving either. He'd have hours with them.
And did he indicate at that time that's when he gave birth to the idea of securing the particular drug from a physician, saying that he was working the third shift and needed that for sleeping purposes?
Well, he did indicate that that's how he was able to receive the drug, and that he pretended that he was the one taking it to get it, but I'm not sure when he started getting it.
There came a time then when he shifted his operations from the bathhouse to local hotels. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. That happened when Mr. Dahmer was thrown out of the only bathhouse available to him in Milwaukee. I think it was the club bath at 57th in Wisconsin. And the people who worked there remembered a number of complaints from clients about Mr. Dahmer drugging people. And one particular incident when an ambulance had to be called because he'd given enough to one man that he couldn't be aroused. And so they'd had to call the paramedics. And Mr. Dahmer recalled the same incident, though he wasn't aware how much they suspected that he was doing there. After that, after they told him he couldn't come back, and without another bathhouse available to him in Milwaukee, he began to take men to hotels, and there were 3 particular hotels that he used for that purpose. And he indicated to me that he took men to hotels for sexual purposes and to drug them and have sex with them on as many as 10 occasions.
And did there come a time at or about this time after he had started into the hotels that he spoke about seeing a video named Faces of Death?
Yes.
Would you share that with the jury, the discussion you had with him on that?
He told me that sometime after having killed Mr. Hicks and before killing Stephen Tomey, there was an occasion when he discovered some videos, commercially prepared videos that are marketed under the title Faces of Death. I was familiar with these because it was a fad a few years ago for teenagers to rent these, and they are a compilation of particularly gruesome and explicit real footage of various events around the world. And Mr. Dahmer asked me if I was familiar with those and said that he hadn't told anyone else about this, but that he had watched those videos a couple of times before meeting Stephen Tomey. And had rented them from ordinary video supply places. His description was, quote, "They're pretty gruesome, very realistic. They show people in various stages of death, and they showed an autopsy on one young guy. They cut the skull, removed the brain, cut open the chest area, and removed the organs, sewed them back up. Then they showed executions of World War II and things like that, very graphic." I asked him how many times he'd watched, and he said just once, and that he'd rented them only once. I asked if he did any rewinding while he was watching, and he said, "Yeah, I watched that autopsy of that young guy a couple of times." And I asked whether he masturbated during those videos, and he said, quote, "During that scene, I think I did get off," end quote. I asked whether he thought the film Faces of Death had any effect on him. And he said no, because the thoughts were already in my head, so it didn't give me any new ideas. I asked if it had reawakened any interest, and he said, yeah, it did, that autopsy scene especially, because he was good looking. He was totally naked. I don't know why I happened to have a fascination with that.
Did you discuss with him the Tuomi incident that occurred in November of 1987 at the Ambassador Hotel?
Yes.
And did you spend some time discussing that?
Yes, we discussed it in detail.
Did you, and we won't go over that, but thereafter, did he tell you that he made what his reflections were after the Tuomi incident?
Yes, he did.
Would you share those with the jury?
Well, he told me that the experience led him to make 2 changes. The first was, having realized how difficult it was to move a corpse from a hotel room, he decided not to return to hotels anymore. And from that point began to take men back to his grandmother's house, where he would have greater privacy and more space to work. The other thing he told me was that has changed his efforts to control himself. In his words, quote, after that incident, it seemed like there was no point in trying to resist the urges and the compulsion to do that. So that's when I started going out, looking around at the bars for other people. I asked, what do you mean there was no point? And he said, just since it had happened again, much to my surprise, it just I don't know. It's hard to describe. It just felt like there was no point in trying to resist doing that sort of activity. I asked whether he meant that there was no difference between killing a few and killing a lot. And he said, no. It just seemed by that time the driving compulsion to be with someone and control them was so strong and so prevalent throughout all my waking hours that I just continued doing that. It seemed like that broke any thought of holding back and not doing that sort of thing again.
Again, what is the term driving compulsion? Would you comment on that? What he was experiencing, what the paraphilia, what that experiencing was?
Well, the subjective experience of one with a paraphilia and Mr. Dahmer's accounts to me of what he felt is that of a sex urge.
So in other words,
drive.
he's talking about a sexual urge.
Right, a sex urge.
Now, from that time forward, other than his discussion about inhibitions when it came to slaying people, did he ever indicate to you in any way that he attempted to reset his will against doing these things?
Not at all.
Pardon?
No.
All right. Did he ever indicate that he tried to, again, to resist these ideas or to change what he was doing?
He gave no indication of ever trying to resist from that point.
There followed thereafter the slaying of Mr. Dockstader. The slaying of the death of Twomey was in November of 1987. There followed thereafter the slaying of James Dockstader in January 17, 1988, and the slaying of Richard Guerrero on March 27, 1988. You already have testified with respect to those.
Yes.
Did you also discuss with him his encounter with Ronald Flowers on or about April 3rd of 1988?
Yes.
Would you share with the jury your reflections on that?
Mr. Dahmer told me that he met Mr. Flowers in front of the gay bars downtown and offered him money to return with him.
This is the incident where the man's car wasn't operating. He had difficulty with his car.
That's right.
Right.
Well, yes, that is the same incident. He did take the man back, and as Mr. Dahmer described it to me, he drugged the man in the basement, and in the morning, the man woke up after Mr. Dahmer had had light sex with him. Mr. Dahmer then took $80 from him, walked him to the bus stop, saw him get on the bus, and said, quote, he was really out of it, drugged, and apparently woke up in some hospital, and that was it, end quote. I asked him if he thought he was going to get caught for that, and he said, no, because I hadn't hurt him in any way. And I said, well, you drugged him and took money, right? And he said, yeah, I figured they would just think that he just lost the money and that he'd been drinking. And I asked, so that was no big risk to you? And he said, no. And I asked if his grandmother had seen him with the man, and he said, yes. I said, what was her response? And he said, negative. That's one of the reasons shortly after that, I moved out to the 24th Street apartment. He had also told the police that when his grandmother saw him with this individual in the basement, he decided not to kill this victim. That such a decision not to kill someone because a witness had seen you with them would be an indication of his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, and is consistent with what Mr. Dahmer told me about every one of the charged killings, namely that if his grandmother had walked in, he would not have committed the killing. On another occasion, Mr. Dahmer told the police that in the morning his grandmother saw Mr. Flowers there, at which time Mr. Dahmer figured that Flowers was too big and he didn't want to cause a commotion, and his grandmother had seen him, so he did not kill him, which again is an indication of the capacity to conform his conduct when it suits him to do so. There was also a discrepancy between some marks on Mr. Flowers' neck that Mr. Flowers described and Mr. Dahmer's recollection, in that Mr. Flowers said that there was a circular mark about his neck, and Mr. Dahmer said that he hadn't done anything to the man's neck. And lastly, from that incident, there was an occasion when Mr. Flowers again was in Milwaukee and encountered Mr. Dahmer at a bar and confronted him. And Mr. Flowers pointed out that he remembered who Mr. Dahmer was. And Mr. Flowers got angry and was accusatory toward Mr. Dahmer. And as soon as this happened, Mr. Dahmer backed off and left the club and got in a taxi and went away, so that he avoided a confrontation with a fully alert adult male, which I think is informative as to why he drugs individuals before he kills them. That is, there are multiple reasons he does it. One of them, at least in some instances, is to avoid a physical fight or a confrontation. And specifically with respect to the killings of Raymond Smith and David Thomas, Mr. Dahmer acknowledged to me that that was one of the reasons that he killed them, because he didn't want to have a fight with them in the morning.
Thereafter, he secured, I'm sorry, did you complete your comments on Flowers?
Yes.
Thereafter, he secured an apartment near North 24th and West Wells Street, and there ensued on September 26, 1988, involvement with a juvenile that we have referred to as SS. Did you discuss that incident with Mr. Dahmer?
Yes.
Would you share your reflections on that with the jury?
Well, he told me that he approached SS because he liked his physique, and that he brought him back to under the pretext of taking pictures of him, and in fact did take pictures of him, that he drugged the young man, after which the young man fell asleep. I'm sorry, need to correct that. The young man didn't fall asleep. He said that he did administer the drug, and that after the young man had gone home, he apparently had fallen asleep and his parents had called the police. I don't think that's exactly what had happened, because I've read the police reports of what everyone else had to say. But it is the case that after the young man left, he was discovered to be in an unusual condition of intoxication and brought to the hospital from where the police were called. But most importantly, Mr. Dahmer told me that he had no intention of doing SS any harm. And I asked, why is that? And he said, I had to be at work that night. And I said, which meant there wasn't time to really make it worthwhile? And he said, right. Now, I think that is an indication of his capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, in that this was a young man whose physique fit the desired profile for Mr. Dahmer. He had available to him the only apparatus he needed to carry out his usual plan, namely drugs and the privacy of his apartment. And yet he refrained from killing him simply because Mr. Dahmer had to go to work that night and wouldn't have had the time to enjoy the victim's body. So that informs us as to how strong the sexual urge is. It informs us as to how readily Mr. Dahmer is able to obey the law when he chooses to do so. He said that when he was subsequently arrested for that, he was shocked by the police coming out to work and arresting him, and that he spent 6 days in jail before making bond, and then went back to his apartment and immediately destroyed the skull that he had there and moved out of the apartment because he was concerned about the incriminating evidence being discovered. And he said at that time that was the only incriminating evidence that was present, and he destroyed it, which is further indication of his awareness of the wrongfulness of saving skulls.
Thereafter, the homicide of Anthony Sears occurred on March 25, 1989. The defendant was sentenced on May 23, 1989 to a work release period. Then in May 20, 1990, the homicide of Raymond Smith occurred. And on June 24, 1990, the homicide of Edward Smith. You've already spoken to those homicides. And on July 8, 1990, there was an encounter with a juvenile that we've referred to as LP. Did you discuss that encounter with the defendant?
Yes, I did.
Would you share with the jury his comments and your reflections on that incident?
On this occasion, Mr. Dahmer said that he had run out of the drugs that he'd used on other victims and was short on money. He had already met LP and arranged a date with him. There'd been a confusion about whether it was 12 noon or 12 midnight they'd meet, but he was expecting to get together with him. And in anticipation of getting together with him, he went to an Army surplus store where he bought a rubber mallet and then went to the bars at midnight for his second effort to have the date with the young man, and did encounter him, take him home, and while at home, told him that he wanted to take pictures of him and had him lie down on the bed. And once he was face down on the bed, that is LP was, Mr. Dahmer said that he struck him in the back of his neck with the mallet, hoping to knock him out. And that didn't work. Got up, was very upset, got dressed, left the apartment, said he was going to call the police. About 15 minutes later, he comes back, knocks on the outer door of the apartment building. I let him in. He says he needs money to get a cab, and I didn't want him to leave again, so I grabbed his neck. We struggled in the living room area for about 10 minutes. We were both tired out. I wanted to calm the situation down. We walked into the bedroom. I was talking with him all night, trying to calm him down and make it so he wouldn't call the police. He agreed. About 7 in the morning, we both walked up to the 21st Street corner on Wisconsin Avenue. I called him a cab and he left. And it turns out he did tell the police, but he gave them a wild story that I had knocked him out somewhere on the road and carried him back, so they didn't believe him. In the course of our discussion of this case, I asked, after calming him down, you even got him to agree to let you tie his hands behind his back? And he said he had. And I said, for a half an hour, over the next half hour, according to the account the victim gave, he wiggled free, and then you grabbed a knife, and he confirmed that that had happened. I asked why he had restrained him, and he said, just so he wouldn't be able to run out on me before I calmed things down. I asked why he'd used the knife, and he said, just to keep him from jumping up and leaving, and acknowledged that he'd used the knife to intimidate him. He said that was the same knife that he'd used on the other victims. I asked if there was a time at which he intended to kill him, and he said, yeah, right, when I struck him. And I asked whether that had changed, his intent to kill. And he said, after the struggle. And I said, how did that change that? And he said, too tired, I don't know. This is out of character for me. I just wanted to talk him down, and I just wasn't drunk anymore, just didn't have it in me to do it. Now, that last statement, excuse me, as to why he changed his mind about killing this victim is consistent with the other statements that Mr. Dahmer made to me and the other evidence that I've reviewed, namely that when he forms the intent to kill, he requires the effects of alcohol to decrease his inhibitions against killing. And in this instance, among the reasons that he then refrained from killing are, first, the effects of the alcohol were wearing off, as he told me, and secondly, that he was tired and didn't feel he had the energy to do it. I believe that that is evidence of the strength of the sexual urge that he was experiencing and shows us that his sexual urge, like that of of many individuals is one that is not so strong that when he's too tired, he'd prefer not to engage in the sexual activity. And it confirms, of course, that without the effects of the alcohol, he finds the killing too aversive to engage in. I asked if he started looking over his shoulder afterward, and he said for a few days, perhaps a week afterwards, he had, indicating that he was aware of the wrongfulness and that the police might be interested in this event. And then I asked, it sounds like there are multiple reasons then that you changed your mind about killing. He answered, he was wide awake, I got to know him better, and I just didn't have what it took to hurt him. I asked, did it make any difference when he talked about his family? And he said, yeah, I suppose it did. I got to know him, just couldn't do it. The reason I asked that is that some research on hostage takers indicates that they are less likely to kill victims if the victims develop some relationship with them and they begin to see them as real people. And here I thought that perhaps this captive young man had been seen in the same way, that is, he'd come to be seen more as a whole person than as a sex object, and that might have played a part in inhibiting Mr. Dahmer from killing him, and he acknowledged as that was so. And I think that, once again, the reasons he gives for changing his mind about killing him are an indication of the fact that this is not a compulsion to kill, and that the sexual urges were not so strong that they couldn't be resisted under these circumstances. Said he had bought the hammer on that occasion because it was cheaper than having his prescription filled.
Doctor, I'm going to ask a broader question. Was there any other evidence bearing on Mr. Dahmer's responsibility at the time of the charged killings that you have not yet discussed?
Yes, there is.
And would you share those matters with the jury?
An investigative report from the Bath Police Department quoted Mr. Dahmer as stating that the reason for his murders was, quote, my own warped, selfish desire for self-gratification. And the police quoted him as saying that particular thing on 2 occasions, that he had committed the murders because of his own selfish desire for self-gratification. That I interpret as a statement of his capacity to conform his conduct, in that he committed the murders in order to gratify his sexual urges, and felt that gratifying his sexual urges was more important than the alternative, which would have been to let these men live. Second point that I hadn't mentioned earlier was a comment that Mr. Dahmer made to the police about events that transpired while he was living at his grandmother's house. Apparently, his aunt, I don't know if it's Eunice or Eunice, but I think his Aunt Eunice had complained about the foul smell emanating from the basement at the grandmother's house. And Mr. Dahmer on that occasion had made excuses for what the odor was, first saying that the cat Jody had fouled the kitty litter box. And then when that explanation didn't sell too well, he gave a different explanation, making up a story that he'd found a dead raccoon and cut up the raccoon in the basement to save the bones. And he said that he'd made up those stories because he realized it was the odor of dismembered bodies coming from the basement. And the making of cover stories is a reflection of his awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions, and that he needed to conceal what in fact he was doing. Mr. Dahmer also told me that the odor of dismemberment had always been a turnoff. And we had a series of, I'm sorry, if I could start that sentence again. Sorry to be fumbling with my notes too here. Here's what I was looking for. There was a particular conversation that I had with Mr. Dahmer in which I asked him questions about his responsibility in general, and I'd like to quote what he said in that discussion. The exact questions and answers were, for every one of the victims that you're charged with killing, did you appreciate that it was wrong at the time you killed them? His answer was, yes. I asked, and if your grandmother or another witness had walked in just before you killed him, would you have killed him? Answer, no, I would not. Question, you would have stopped? Answer, uh-huh. Question, if for every one of them, if they had agreed to stay with you, that you would not have killed them? Answer, yeah, right. Question, but yet there does seem to be a change toward the end. You've described to me a number of elements of that. Even when you were bringing them back more quickly, getting sloppy, things were going badly for you. Even then, you still knew it was wrong? Answer, yeah, I always had that sense that it was wrong. I don't think anybody can kill somebody and think that it's right. Question, even at your sloppiest, with all of these charged offenses, if somebody had walked in? Answer, no, I wouldn't have done that. Question, you wouldn't have done them if you didn't think you could get away with it? Answer, no. Although with LP, I probably could have done it, but we talked and I got to know him. For some reason, I was willing to take the risk that he wouldn't say anything. Question, right. He decided not to. Answer, yeah, didn't have any alcohol at that point either, so I wasn't in the right mindset. My inhibitions were quite high then. Question, did you find yourself drinking to try to drown your inhibitions? Answer, and it always worked. Question, did you know that if you didn't drink, you wouldn't be able to go through with it? Answer, I may have been able to go through with it, but it would have made it harder. Question, you might have been able to strangle them anyway? Answer, Question, how would it have been harder? Answer, I may not have had the sexual arousal to the degree I did when I was drinking. Maybe not, I don't know, maybe I would have. I was usually drinking when it happened. Question, the drinking you think was an aphrodisiac for you? Answer, it served that purpose, yeah. Question, it also made you feel less badly about the killing, is that correct? Answer, maybe, although I was so intent on fulfilling this desire I had, I don't know how badly I would have felt, even if I hadn't been drinking. I don't know. Those are all hypothetical questions. I don't know how to answer that. Question, okay, that's fair. Were there any instances with these men whom you did in fact kill, where you thought that you would not kill them when you went with them, and then changed your mind later? Answer, no, I usually was pretty thorough in finding someone that I was attracted to and wanted to keep. Question, but some other ones whom you didn't kill, you knew in advance you weren't going to? Answer, Question, you knew in advance you had a different plan with them? Answer, I just couldn't find anyone who was really my type, but I still wanted to be with someone, so I settled for second best. Question, but these others were keepers. Answer, right. Question, did you think of it that way, as keepers? Answer, you could use that term, yeah. Question, that wasn't a term you thought of? Answer, no, it fits the bill. In addition to that conversation that encompasses a great deal, there were many details discussed in the course of the 3 days of interviews, and many details that emerged from police reports that bear on the issue of Mr. Dahmer's responsibility. One is that Mr. Dahmer is quoted in a police report as saying that after hosing down the basement floor at his grandmother's house and washing all the blood down the drain after dismembering victims, he was careful that none of the body parts or chunks of flesh got into the drain, and that after disposing of the body parts and the bones and hosing down the blood, he'd pour a full gallon bottle of bleach down the drain in order to get rid of the smell. Those tasks are an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct, that he's trying to carefully get rid of the evidence and the odor. Likewise, from a police report, Mr. Dahmer said that he bought the knife that he used to dismember victims at his grandmother's house and disposed of the knife the same way he did the body, namely throwing it into the trash. He also said that he threw away the clothing of victims from his grandmother's house. And the disposal of the clothing and the knife is an indication of his appreciation of the wrongfulness of his conduct. I asked Mr. Dahmer in my own examination of him, would you use a condom when you had intercourse with the corpses? Answer, yeah, I would. Question, and there you had time to answer, mm-hmm. Question, were you faithful about doing that? Answer, right. His use of a condom before engaging in anal intercourse with the corpses in whom he had a necrophilic interest is an indication of the state of mind he was in at the time. It's an indication of the strength of his sexual urges. I think it's a common experience among males to have had occasions when the urge seemed to be too intense to delay to make use of a condom even when they wished to do that. And that Mr. Dahmer's use of a condom in these circumstances with corpses is an indication that the intensity of his sexual urge at that point was less than that many teenagers experience in the backseat with a girlfriend. There was another occasion when I was asking Mr. Dahmer about some of the particular ways in which he had disposed of the remains of victims, when I was curious about some instances in which he had peeled the skin off the soles of feet, which seemed an unusual thing to do. And I asked him why that had happened, and he said that he'd done that to provide more surface area for the acid to disintegrate the feet. He had discovered that the soles of the feet were tougher and took longer to acidify, and then did this so that it would not take as much time to dispose of the evidence. He also mentioned having used a saw to cut the femurs, which is the long bone of the leg, in half so it would fit inside the barrel. I had made a couple observations at the apartment building where Mr. Dahmer last lived before his arrest that I asked him about. One was a hypothesis I developed there about which it turned out I was wrong when I asked him. It seemed to me that the front of the building he lived in, the facade of it, was recognizably different from others in the area, and I wondered whether he might have taken victims in the back door so that in case someone were to escape or to leave, that it would be less easy for them to recognize the front of the building. This is just an idea I had when I visited there. I asked him about it, and he said that that wasn't so, that he had gone in the back door merely because it was closer to his apartment and didn't require taking the elevator all the way up. And then I asked him, you weren't concerned about anyone being able to recognize the front of the building again? And he said no. And I asked a leading question, which isn't the best technique, but I did in this instance, and said, because you figured they weren't leaving? And he said, right. Indicating that at the time he took victims in, he had already planned on killing them. I asked what position he was in with the victims when he strangled them, that is, those he strangled, and he said that they were on the bed, lying on their backs, that he always got them in bed before they passed out. I asked if he would get on top of them when strangling them, and he said no, that he was to the side of them, usually lying beside them and facing them. And he said that before using the strap for strangulation, he had, in all other instances of strangulation, used only his hands. I asked him about quantities of ether and chloroform that had been found at the apartment, and he said that he had begun using those chemicals with Mr. Lindsay, and that the way he had administered it was to put a dust mask that looks like a surgical mask on the victim after the victim was drugged, and was trying to use ether or chloroform to anesthetize the victims while they were already unconscious as a result of the effects of the drug, to facilitate the surgical procedure, the drilling into the skull, but that he didn't think that the ether or the chloroform had been very effective for this purpose. He had, that is, Mr. Dahmer had made mention to someone else, I think the police, that at the time he dismembered bodies, he would generally become naked. And so I asked him about that to see if that were sexual. And he said that it was not, that the purpose, I said, well, I asked, what was the purpose of that? And he said, because it was very messy, bloody, I didn't want to get it on my clothes. He said he'd begun to do that with the dismemberment of Cash D, that is Raymond Smith. I asked whether he'd become naked at his grandmother's house while dismembering, and he said no, that he just wore old clothes, that he was careful there, rolled up his sleeves, and had more room to work. I asked where he had done the dismembering, and he said that except in one instance, he had always done that in the bathroom. I asked about the other instance, which was the man whose skin he had removed while the man was in the bedroom on a plastic sheet. And he said that even in that instance, he had been cautious to remove the internal organs in the bathroom because he didn't want to have blood everywhere. I said the nudity while dismembering shouldn't be taken then as an indication of sexual excitement, and he said no, that it shouldn't. I asked, was there a ritual? And he said no. I asked, were you in a frenzy? And he said, I tried to do it as quickly as I could, yeah. I said, because, I guess I laughed, and he said, because of the smell factor. I said, so you were in a hurry? And he said, right. And he added, you mentioned in a frenzy. That's a good way of putting it, because a few times while I was in the middle of the process, there were knocks on the doors and stuff, odors and stuff. So that would really get me going. I would pretend not to be home sometimes, not answer the door. Other times I would. I said, you'd feel very anxious? And he said, putting it mildly. I said, what was the fear that you, and he interrupted and said, extreme anxiety. I asked what he feared, and he said that what I was doing would be discovered. So he endorsed the concept of a frenzy to mean that he was quickly hurrying through dismemberment because the odor was so repulsive and because he feared discovery, and even heard knocks on the door sometimes while dismembering, all of which is an indication of his awareness of the wrongfulness of that conduct. I also asked him about something that appeared in a police report that indicated that he had masturbated while looking at body parts in jars of formaldehyde, and Mr. Dahmer said that that was not the case. That's not what had happened. And I asked him again whether that had ever happened, and he said no, it never happened that he masturbated while looking at a body part in formaldehyde. I asked him how he had felt when he would place remains of victims out in the dumpster or in the garbage, because there was a mention at one point in a report that he had felt some sense of loss when giving up the remains of a victim. But his response here was that he felt apprehensive. And he said there was a large, very large dumpster, metal dumpster. So I'd usually try to place it when it was about half full, so it would be covered over at the time, because there were a lot of bums that came around and looked for cans in the trash. So it gave me a worry. That's when I started using that acid technique. I asked him whether he'd ever disposed of whole, long bones in the trash, and he said, never, no. I said, because of what? He said, the possibility of discovery. I said, from limbs? He said, right. I said, or intact heads? He said, right. I asked, why do you think they would be more likely to be discovered? And he said, because they wouldn't decay. I asked if he worried about the bags ripping open, and he said, yeah, that's why I triple bagged them. I asked if he felt a sense of relief every time the trash truck drove away, and he said that he did. He also mentioned on another occasion that he was always careful to make sure that no one saw what was in the trash bags. He said that there were times when he decided not to go out and entice back another victim during the weekend because he was already busy disposing of the remains of a preceding victim. I asked whether he blocked out thoughts of who these people were or their families, and he said that he did. I asked him why, and he said because it made it easier to do the act and to depersonalize them. I asked if he had, in fact, wanted bondage pictures of Tracy Edwards, or whether that had been a pretext to get control, and he said that he'd say that sometimes to get the cuffs on them, and that it really wasn't that he wanted to get bondage pictures, but rather that he wanted to gain control of the men. I asked him, do you think you're responsible for what you did? And he said, well, I know I'm responsible because I was the one that caused everything to happen. I commented to him, I think you've been very forthright about that and haven't tried to shift the blame to anybody else or anything else. And he replied, no, the blame belongs on me. No one else had anything to do with it. He commented to me later, quote, it's a strange situation to be in. I mean, I was so intent on having a great deal of control and shaping my own destiny, and now it's all out of my hands, end quote. He also commented in the same tone, quote, you can't keep running from the truth forever. Eventually you have to face the consequences. It may take years, but eventually you do. And I'm just sick and tired of the lies, the hiding parts of my life. I'm tired of it, want to cleanse my conscience as much as I can. I asked him whether if he'd had a vehicle, he might have disposed of evidence otherwise rather than dismembering. And he said that he thought he would have dismembered them anyway, and said that he would have done so partly because he would have wanted to save something from the victims for himself. I said, but you could have saved a lot of work by taking the bodies elsewhere and disposing of them. He said, that's true, but then there's always the possibility of evidence being discovered, so I wouldn't have done that. Mr. Dahmer had told the police some other points that I haven't yet mentioned that bear on his responsibility. One has to do with how he would select the victims whom he brought home. And he had told the police that before going out in the evening, he would generally know whether or not he planned to commit a homicide. That before going out, he'd prepare the medication by powdering it and leaving it in a glass on the countertop in the kitchen. He described the kind of body build that he was looking for and said that he generally looked for individuals that were alone or not with a tight-knit group, that he'd generally wait until the closing of the tavern, and when the patrons were filing out, he'd approach the victims and ask them if they wanted to accompany him home for the usual reasons of pictures or sex or to drink, and that he also looked for men without a car. And so Mr. Dahmer had a particular kind of male in both body build and in situation that he sought. Mr. Dahmer also told the police, as he told me, that he received physical pleasure from being with the victims while they were alive and would have preferred that the victims remain alive, that it was better to have them with him dead than to have them leave, and that he would generally decide to kill them when they indicated that they were about to leave. Finally, I asked Mr. Dahmer whether he missed drinking since he'd been locked up. And he said that he had not in the past been drinking every day, only when he committed the offenses. I'm sorry, this was not my question. This was from the police. He told the police this, that he stated that when he killed the individuals, he was always drunk, and the drinking helped him get into the frame of mind and made it easier for him. He didn't drink every day, but when he planned to get someone, he would start drinking after he planned, and then he was usually drunk when he killed them. He related that he even drank when he was cutting up the bodies, and stated that it helped him to make it easier when he was doing this. And that is consistent with what he told me with respect to his drinking at the time of the offenses, though he had indicated to me that he was drinking every weekend and not only at the time of the offenses. That, I think, exhausts that list.
Did you also have occasion to read what lay witnesses said about the behavior of Mr. Dahmer, and what consideration did you give that?
Yes, I read the accounts given to the police from a large number of persons who knew Mr. Dahmer over the years and who had observations about his behavior. They included his relatives, his parents, his mother, his brother, his grandmother, his stepmother, accounts from a large number of people who knew him during his high school years, including the few people who were friends, accounts of the neighbors around his grandmother's house who had seen him there, accounts from people who knew him in the gay community, and people he'd run into at various clubs, the manager of the apartment building, and a large number of the neighbors in the apartment building, and of course all of those accounts of the persons who were present during the incident when Conrack synthesumphone was outside the apartment. And finally, accounts from a large number of co-workers and people who knew Mr. Dahmer from the chocolate factory.
And you evaluated and weighed those in the formation of your opinion?
Yes, I did.
You touched briefly subsequent to the West Dallas Library incident, you touched briefly onto a potential interest in the occult that Mr. Dahmer considered at that time. That would be in 85 or 86. Did you have further reflections on that, and what caused or occasioned those reflections?
Well, on this theme of the occult in various ways, there are a number of chapters, I think. One is in high school, where Mr. Dahmer and the person he befriended his senior year, Jeff Six, would have some discussions about the occult. But according to both Mr. Dahmer and Jeff Six, Mr. Dahmer wasn't all that interested in it. There was another person they knew who seemed to be quite taken by all that, but it wasn't Jeffrey Dahmer, who was very interested. Though they did play with this, and there was an occasion when Mr. Dahmer and friends pretended to have a seance, or thought they were having a seance during junior or senior year of high school. And they sat about in a darkened room and tried to contact spirits. Some of the boys carried on, and the girls got scared and ran across the street. And there may have been more than one seance, because the recollections differ on exactly which youths were there at the time. At one of them, one of the boys bought some magic powder and threw it on a candle. And there was one occasion when Mr. Dahmer was interrupted by his father, and father was not encouraging of all this. But that, I think, is the actual tone of the activities related to the occult while he was still living at home with his parents, and that there was nothing more to it than a kind of ordinary juvenile curiosity and playfulness. There did later come a time, however, in young adulthood, while living with his grandmother, that I alluded to earlier, when Mr. Dahmer developed some curiosity as to whether there could be a dark side of spiritual belief that could be useful to him. This is after the period when he found that religion wasn't satisfying his desires. And here he told police that he felt religion wasn't working, and maybe he should delve into the occult and Satanism. That after reading several books and dabbling in it, he realized this was not for him, and then he again gave in to his homosexual tendencies, was the language that the officers used. He began by going to the bookstores, where he obtained information regarding gay areas in Milwaukee, and he began reading gay and homosexual pornography and became acquainted with bars in town, and became a patron of the baths. Now, when I talked to Mr. Dahmer about reading any satanic materials, he told me that he had read a particular book, or at least parts of it, called the Satanic Bible, which is a commercially produced book that he'd bought at an ordinary bookstore, and that book had two different components to it. One was that it seemed to be saying that one should feel free to do any selfish thing one pleases, and he found that appealing because it was consistent with his own view of the world. But he said there was a lot of mystical material in the book too, and various kinds of other things that were more supernatural ideas, and he didn't relate to any of that, and rejected it. And so that was not of any further significance to him. There then later came a time when this interest resurfaced again, and this later time was after the murder of Anthony Sears. So this is after 3 of the charged killings and a total of 5 killings. For the first time, it occurred to Mr. Dahmer about some idea of starting a temple. And in his words, he had found Mr. Sears exceptionally attractive. Sorry, I should quote him when I say his words. Quote, "I found him very exceptionally attractive, and the desire to retain something from him was stronger than the fear of being caught, I guess. That was about the time I had the table, the black table and the 2 griffins, and that's when I started formulating the idea of the temple area off of this. It's the time I started watching Return of the Jedi." So the first idea of the temple area occurs only after 3 of the charged killings. And because this seemed curious, I explored what he had in mind about the temple and what the significance of this movie was to him in great depth. And in fact, he and I sat together and watched all of the scenes in the film Return of the Jedi that he considered significant. Likewise, there came a time later when he put that film aside and began making use of Exorcist 3 and particular scenes from that in a similar manner. And he and I sat together and watched those scenes from Exorcist 3 so that I could explore what the significance was to him of the images in those materials. And I think that what emerges from all of that is an understanding that Mr. Dahmer regarded one character in each of those films, a character known as the Emperor in Return of the Jedi, and the character who's obviously supposed to be Satan in Exorcist 3, a man who's confined in a cell-like area at that time. And what these characters have in common is that they are evil and corrupt and powerful, and both have the ability to use special powers to control others. In the case of the Emperor, he seems to be zapping people with energy beams of some kind and able to manipulate them in that way because it's futuristic. In the Exorcist 3, the power comes from being able to create illusions to make people think that there are snakes crawling over them, to suspend people on the ceiling, to be able to do all manner of things. Each of the characters in the scenes that he repeatedly viewed actually torments someone else in a way that might be described as torture. But Mr. Dahmer said that was not what was appealing to him, though there were occasionally fantasies where that might be, that he never enacted that. And he's consistently told me that making others suffer was not his desire sexually, but that he did identify with the power of these characters. The characters are unattractive ones in both those scenes, and not ones that one would expect most people to want to identify with. But he liked the idea of the power that they had. And it happens that both those characters are portrayed in the films with yellow eyes that give them an eerie look. And Mr. Dahmer even went to the extent of buying a pair of contact lenses with that yellow tint that he would wear when he would go to the clubs so that he could have more of that look. His dabbling with these films and using them wasn't just ordinary curiosity. It's something a little more than that, in that he wanted to be more like those people. And he describes some sense of using the films to get himself in the proper mood to go out and cruise for a victim. And sometimes he would bring the victim home and watch a portion of a film with them and direct their attention to those scenes too. And so it did play some part in setting the right mood for him for committing these crimes. And he explained that he identified with the characters because he felt that he was thoroughly evil and corrupt, just as those two characters were. Though he didn't feel he was as powerful as they, nor did he ever give any indication to me or in any of the materials I've read that he ever believed he would acquire any magical powers from them, or that he would be able to be like those people, or be able to create illusions or use zapping energy rays. None of those things were beliefs about himself. But because this was so odd, it needed to be explored to see whether there was a psychiatric symptom here that needed to be accounted for. And that's particularly true with respect to this issue that eventually emerges of the temple. Mr. Dahmer drew for me a diagram of what he had in mind for the temple. It's really exactly like the one that he drew for Dr. Becker. And that diagram of the temple shows 10 skulls on a table with incense burning on both ends and 2 whole skeletons on either end of the black table with the plaster griffins above the table and a special globe lamp to impart an eerie sense of lighting. And he wanted a black leather chair so that he could sit in the leather chair and admire his collection. Now, the specific details of what he thought could happen there or wanted there come down to his wanting to have these objects, his believing that if he had them, it would provide him some kind of satisfaction, and his suspicion, and I think belief would be too strong, that maybe if he did this and had it set up this way, he would be able to become, somehow get in touch with some spiritual force or power. But he never indicated to me or to anyone else, as far as I can tell, that he believed he would obtain special powers from this, or that he thought it was going to give him magical abilities. It was more a matter of a suspicion or hope. It's something much vaguer than a belief. And his actions confirm that he was not acting under the belief that he was creating a temple that would give him special powers. In particular, I think that's clear when one notes that on June 30 of 1991, Mr. Dahmer made a false police report to the Chicago police about a stolen wallet, which was part of his effort to be excused for yet another absence from the chocolate factory where his job was in jeopardy, so that he could stay in Chicago and continue to go to the gay strip clubs and the baths, and which was on the same trip from which he brought Mr. Turner home. If he thought he was about to have a temple that would give him magical powers, I don't think he would have taken such steps to preserve his job at the chocolate factory. Likewise, on July 13 of 1991, Mr. Dahmer called the chocolate company on a Friday night and said he couldn't come in to work that night because he had to take his sick grandmother to the hospital. They told him he'd need proof, and he was unable to obtain proof. Here again, if he thought he was about to have special powers from a mystical temple, he would not have needed to lie to preserve his job at the chocolate factory. I believe.
All right, please.